All right. Hello. This is the lecture for this week. We're going to be talking about the basic argument, right? So this is from Galen Strawson. Right? So you should have done the reading at this point. So read from the beginning of the paper until the end of section three. And you can keep reading if you want to. It's a good paper, I think. But anyway, um, good. So at this point, you should have watched the documentary, right? From PBS on Leopold and Loeb. Anyway, uh, let's get started. The basic argument, right, it's supposed to show that none of us, right, can ever be truly, ultimately, morally responsible for anything, right? That's sort of the big idea here, and we're going to try to unpack exactly what that says, or what that means. So, earlier this week, I asked you to consider your judgments about some cases. So they're the easy case, a strong wind, stop hitting yourself, a harder case, and another harder case. Um, so I just want to sort of talk through these cases and sort of normal responses to them, or like statistically normal responses. So the easy case. So here I am. I'm in full command of my faculties, right? I'm not like impaired. I'm not drunk or anything, right? I'm just being me, right? And I judge that it's appropriate to knock Trevor down, right? And I do so. Am I responsible for knocking Trevor down? I think most people would say, yeah, right. In fact, having looked at responses on Notebowl so far, almost everyone, I don't think there's anyone, in fact, who said that I wasn't responsible for knocking Trevor down. Right. And the sorts of reasons that people give are like this, right? Look, I'm in full command of my faculties, right? I've judged, right, that it's appropriate to do it, right? I'm not in the grip of any sort of delusion, right? I'm just going through sort of normal everyday reasoning, and I judge that it's appropriate. Most people, I think, would say that I'm responsible for knocking Trevor down. So maybe what is the sort of responsibility at issue here? Well, it's the sort of stuff for which we can hold one another responsible, right? So if I knock Trevor down in this circumstance in the easy case, right, I take it that Trevor can be like, "Hey, man, you shouldn't have done that." Right? He can be angry at me. He can resent me. Right? That's a sort of responsibility that we have in mind here. So contrast this with another sort of case, right? A strong wind. A strong wind picks up my body and I knock over Andy. Right? Am I responsible for knocking Andy down? Here, I think we want to say that it would be inappropriate for Andy to be like, "Hey, man, you wronged me." Right? Here, I wasn't in any sort of control. Right? My body was just being sort of thrown about by the wind. Right. Here, most people, I think, would say, I'm not responsible for knocking Andy down. Right. And again, what is this sort of responsibility? Well, when Andy says, "Hey, man, you wronged me," it would be appropriate to say, "No, I didn't. I'm sorry. The wind picked me up," or whatever. In fact, it might not even be appropriate to say sorry, although I did because I'm from the Midwest. But in any case, right here, it doesn't seem like there's any sort of responsibility on my part for knocking Andy down. Right. It's just unfortunate that Andy got caught downwind. Um, okay, so hopefully at this point, the sort of distinction between responsibility and, well, not responsibility is becoming a little bit clearer. Another sort of thing that we might introduce here comes from Strawson, right? So Strawson talks about, the sort of standard story of heaven and hell, right? Where God sends some people to hell for all of eternity to be punished and some people to heaven for all of eternity to be rewarded. Okay, well, what do you have to do to get there? Well, various people disagree, but here's sort of a popular view in like contemporary American pop culture, or if not pop culture, then let's say pop culture, right? Here's a view that many people in American society hold. It's in like the NBC comedy series The Good Place, right? It's something like, look, you go to heaven if you do, or the good place, right? If you do good things, right? If you're responsible for doing good things, right? And you go to hell or the bad place if you do bad things, right? If I'm sort of forced, right, at gunpoint or whatever to do good things, I'm not responsible for the good things, right? If I'm forced at gunpoint to do bad things, I'm not responsible for the bad things, right? Somehow I need to have control over these actions and they need to come from me. They need to be some sort of expression of who I am. Okay, so third case, stop hitting yourself. To grab Devin's hands and cause him to repeatedly hit himself, is Devin responsible for hitting himself? this is another case where everyone's going to say no, right? Devin is not responsible for hitting himself, right? I'm responsible for hitting Devin. Why? Well, the source of the action seems to be outside of Devin, right? The source of the action seems to be me, right? I'm not Devin, right? Or any sort of expression of Devin's will. Okay, so those are, I think, 3 easy cases. Here are, I think, harder cases where people are perhaps less inclined to immediately say yes, responsible, or no, not responsible. So here's the harder case. Saddam Hussein takes me prisoner and threatens to kill my family if I do not torture an innocent person. Well, it turns out that I torture the innocent person, right, because I'm afraid for my family. Am I responsible for torturing the innocent person? People seem to be split on this in their responses on Notebold. So some people say, yeah, you are because you chose to do it. Right? Other people seem to think that like being under duress somehow mitigates responsibility. Maybe you're not responsible, or maybe you're not as responsible as you would be if you like just showed up to work one morning as a torturer and decided to torture someone. But here, views seem to be split. Right? On the one hand, yeah, you did it. You chose to do it in some sense of chose. On the other hand, like, what kind of choice are you really faced with here? Okay, so here's another harder case, or I think it's a harder case. So suppose I'm addicted to smoking, and against my better judgment, I have another cigarette. Am I responsible for having that cigarette? Here are some common things that people have said about this case in our Notebold discussion. One is that you are responsible because you could have said no to having that cigarette, right? It's within your power or something like this, or it was like logically open to you to say no. Okay. Another thing that seemed to be a common response is like, oh, you're not responsible for having this one because you're addicted, but you were responsible for becoming addicted, right? Because you could have chosen at that point pre-addiction, right, to not have a cigarette. You could have just said no. So those are 2 really common responses that people have given. Here's a third less common response, but a few people have said it in our Notebold discussion. Once you're in the throes of addiction, right, you're no longer in control, right? And because you're not in control, you're not responsible for having that cigarette, right? Something that's not an expression of you or your will forced you to have that cigarette, right? Since the action doesn't come from you, right, you're not responsible, or something like this. This seems to be what people were getting at in the Notebold discussion. Okay. So these are some of the judgments that we have had. Right. And one thing that we're maybe interested in doing in philosophy is like putting together all these judgments and seeing if there's anything sort of, what's the word? Anything general that we can say about them that makes sense of our responses to these cases. Right. So is there some principle about responsibility that allows us to say what we want to say about these cases? Right, some general principle about when you are or aren't responsible. On the face of it, it's going to be really difficult to come by any such general principle, right? Especially in cases like another harder case where people seem to be split, or in a harder case where people seem to be split, right? We seem to be pulled in different directions by these sorts of cases. But maybe one thing to say at this point is that there are cases like the first 3, right, where it's really clear, it seems really clear to people that you are or aren't responsible for the things that happen in these cases. And maybe the thought then is that any picture of responsibility or what's required for responsibility, any theory about this that we as philosophers are trying to put together, had better make it the case that we can sometimes be responsible for what we do. Okay, so maybe here's something sort of general that we can say right now, not as a theory, right, but what seems to be relevant to whether or not someone was responsible for what they did. So we judge in these cases that folks are responsible or not on a bunch of different bases, right? There are a bunch of different things that we bring to bear on the question, is so-and-so responsible for what they did in these cases, right? So some of the things we consider are like, well, what alternative was available to them? Was there any alternative available to them, right? source of the action? Did it come from within them as like an expression of who they are, right? Or was it some sort of external force, right? As in the I grabbed Devin's hands, stop hitting yourself case. Maybe did they think about what they did, right? So if by reflex I punch someone in the face, right, am I responsible for punching them in the face? Well, we might want to say no, because it wasn't as though like I even thought about it, right? It was a reflex. And finally, were they somehow forced? Was there some sort of, Jake likes this word, compulsion, right, to act in a particular sort of way? Right, so maybe that's what happens in the harder case, right? I'm compelled by Saddam Hussein's threaten to kill me, right, that I torture the innocent person. Or in the another harder case, I'm compelled by my addiction to smoking, right, to have another cigarette. Yeah. But in any case, right, here's the sort of general thing we can say at this point, right? There are a bunch of different things that we bring to bear when we ask this question, whether we're responsible for the things that we do in particular cases. Right? We think about alternative possibilities, we think about the source of the action, we think about judgments about the action prior to like undertaking the action, right? And we think about compulsion, right, or lack thereof. Okay, so we've talked about responsibility so far in a very general sort of way, right? We've talked about some instances of responsibility, or putative instances of responsibility, and some putative instances where it seems like we're not responsible for what happens, right? But why care about responsibility in the first place? Well, it's tied up with a bunch of things that are more or less central to the way that we live our lives and conceive of ourselves as agents. So here I say, well, why care about responsibility? Well, it's tied up with agency, right? So we're agents. We're things that do things for reasons, right? We act in the world for reasons, right? It's because, for instance, that I want some more tea that I go to the kitchen and boil some water, right? That sort of thing, right? We act for reasons. We have reasons for the things that we do, right? And as agents, we seem to be responsible for what we do. Or at least when we think about agents, we think of them as things that are responsible for what they do, at least much of the time. Okay. It's tied up with responsibility and blame, or punishment and blame, rather. Responsibility is tied up with punishment and blame. So here I am, right? Trevor punched me in the face, right? And I wondered, like, oh, is it appropriate to blame Trevor for what happened? Well, if Trevor's responsible for what happened, right? Maybe Trevor like thought about it, right, and judged with like in the cool light of day that it was appropriate to punch me in the face, right? And then he did it. Maybe it would be appropriate to blame him in that sort of case. But if it was some sort of like reflex, perhaps Trevor's having some sort of seizure, and his arm extends out and punches me in the face, it seems like Trevor's not responsible, and for that reason, it seems inappropriate to blame Trevor for punching me in the face. It's tied up with punishment as well, right? So suppose I commit a crime and I frame you for it, right? So you're not responsible for the murder or whatever that I commit. But the jury finds you guilty and you're sentenced to life in prison, so you're punished. Okay, it seems inappropriate to punish you in this sort of case, right? Given that you were not responsible for what happened. I was, right? I'm the murderer. Right? So punishment seems to require responsibility on behalf of the person who's punished. Okay. The flip side of that, praise and reward seems to require responsibility, right? So suppose you donate a bunch of money to curing malaria, right, or eradicating malaria, rather, and it happens, right? Malaria is eradicated because of your generous donation. Here it seems appropriate to praise you for doing this, right, or reward you perhaps even for doing this. But if I get all the credit, well, that seems inappropriate. Inappropriate in the sense like, oh no, that's not the sort of thing that we would do. It seems like something's gone wrong, right? So if you're responsible for something good, right, it's appropriate to praise you or reward you. If you're not, then it's inappropriate to praise or reward you. Finally, it seems to be tied up with morality, right? Our judgments about people, whether they're good or bad people, seems to be tied up with their being responsible for the things that they do, right? So suppose I'm some sort of moral saint, right? There's a chip implanted in my brain that causes me always to do the right thing, right? Even if I don't want to. well, people will disagree about this sort of case, right? But you might think, well, look, you're not responsible for the good that you do, right? It doesn't come from you; it comes from some sort of external source, right? The chip in the brain. So it seems perhaps to think that uh, you don't deserve to be called a good person on this basis. Okay, so responsibility, why care about it? Well, it's very clearly connected to some central aspects of our lives, right? It's connected to our being like agents. It's respected, or it's connected to punishment and blame, praise and reward, and finally to morality. Okay, so I want to ask now, what would a world without responsibility look like? That is, what would a world where no one is responsible for what they do look like? How would we have to sort of reconceive of how we think about ourselves and one another if we became convinced that no one was responsible, ultimately morally responsible for what they do? At this point, it seems pretty clear, I think, that it would be a radically different sort of world. Things would be very different, right? We couldn't punish or blame one another. It would be inappropriate to praise or reward one another. Perhaps it would be strange to think of ourselves as agents, right? And finally, perhaps notions of morality would sort of break down. Right? So a world without responsibility might look very different, right? Or prima facie, at first glance, right? It seems to look very different. So this is something that I want you to think about. So pause the video now and try to like think about what a world without responsibility, that is, a world where no one is morally responsible for what they do, would look like, right? How would we have to restructure society? What sorts of things would we need to do? Okay, so I hope you paused the video. I took a long pause there. So even if you didn't, you maybe had some time alone with your thoughts. So now I want to talk about some central notions in the basic argument. Right. So the most central notion, besides responsibility, is this notion of being causa sui. Um, here's a quotation from Nietzsche. Right. That's the guy on the left there with the big mustache. So he writes, "The causa sui is the best self-contradiction that has been conceived so far. But the extravagant pride of man has managed to entangle itself profoundly and frightfully with just this nonsense. The desire for freedom of the will in the superlative metaphysical sense, which still holds sway, unfortunately, in the minds of the half-educated. The desire to bear the entire and ultimate responsibility for one's actions oneself rather, and to absolve God, the world, ancestors, chance, and society involves nothing less to be precisely this causa sui and, with more than Baron Munchausen's audacity, to pull oneself out into existence by the hair out of the swamps of nothingness." Okay, so what's going on there? So what Nietzsche's saying, at least in part, is that this notion of being causa sui is like uh, profoundly mistaken, right? The world is not such that we are causa sui, right? And our desire to be sort of ultimately responsible for what we do and what we make of ourselves, right, comes from um, all of these sorts of like bad views of ourselves, right, as being sort of outside of the causal order, right? It's not as though God or the world or ancestors or chance or society has done anything to make us the way that we are, right? If we're causa sui, and Nietzsche thinks that's false, right? The world, ancestors, chance, and society do shape us into the people that we are, right? In the sort of ways that we move about in the world and the sort of decisions that we make. And for this reason, we're not causa sui. We're not self-causing. So the notion of being causa sui is to be self-caused, right? To make ourselves, right? And one reason for thinking that there's something deeply suspect about this view is that it's as though we would have had to like pre-exist ourselves, right? So consider the sorts of views that you have now, sort of like desires and beliefs, reasons for action that you have now. Where did they come from? Well, to some extent, you might have chosen them, right? You might have like embarked on a difficult process of self-discovery in which you're like, oh, look, this is the sort of person that I want to be. Perhaps, right? But some of them seem to come from things outside of ourselves, right? Our parents or education, right? Religion, ancestors, chance, society. Right? So it seems like, at least according to Nietzsche, we don't have the sort of ultimate responsibility that's required here. Okay, so to recap, right, this notion of being causa sui, right, it's being self-caused, right, as being the sort of thing that chooses everything about itself the way that it is, right, all the way back to the very beginning. Okay, so the basic argument comes from Galen Strawson, that's him on the right. And here are some facts about the basic argument. First, it appears to prove that we cannot be truly or ultimately morally responsible for our actions. The argument is apparently independent of issues about free will, right? So read the rest of the paper beyond what's assigned if you want to see why that is. And then finally, here's what the basic argument does, right? It argues that moral responsibility requires that we be causa sui, that is, that we be self-causing, that is, that we choose the sort of principles by which we act, like all the way back to the beginning. And we'll see why that is. But that's the basic argument, what it does, and what it's like in a nutshell. So I want to move on now to what the basic argument is. Okay, so here's a simple statement of the argument. Premise 1, nothing can be causa sui, that is, nothing can be self-caused. Premise 2, in order to be truly morally responsible for one's actions, one would have to be self-caused. Conclusion, therefore, nothing can be truly morally responsible. Okay, so let's try to unpack this really quickly. Strawson's going to give an argument for the claim that nothing can be causa sui, right? Nothing can cause itself. Second premise, in order to be truly morally responsible for one's actions, one would have to be causa sui. We'll see an argument for that as well. But the basic idea here is that in order to be truly morally responsible, right, you have to choose the principles by which you act. Right, those principles would have to be like arrived at by such a decision procedure themselves, and so on back to infinity. Right, this is why nothing can be causa sui. Right, therefore nothing can be truly morally responsible. Okay, so here's the third big idea here. So we started off with responsibility, we saw causa sui, the self-caused notion, and finally we have actions. Okay, so when we're interested in moral responsibility, right, we're interested in those actions that we do or perform for reasons, right? Think about the case where the strong wind carries me away and knocks someone down, right? There, it's not really an action that I do, or at least it's not an action that I did for any sort of reason, right? It's not as though I thought, oh, it'd be really nice if this wind came and carried me away and knocked someone down, right? I didn't cause the wind. I didn't cause my body to move in that sort of way, right? It's not something that I did for a reason. Contrast this with, something like thoroughly every day, right? You get up from your computer chair to go get some water. Okay. What does that look like? Well, in that sort of case, right? Why do you do that? Well, perhaps because you believe that you're thirsty, right? And you desire some water, right? So as a result, you get up. This is an action that you did for reasons, right? Because you were thirsty and because you desire to drink water. Right? So that's an action that you've done for a reason. Okay, so these actions that we do for reasons are, quote, a function of how one is, mentally speaking, unquote. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, the idea is that the actions that you perform for reasons, right, are performed because you have beliefs and desires, right, and those are mental qualities about you. Right, so the actions that we do, right, the actions that we do for reasons, right, are a function of how you are, mentally speaking. Okay, now the claim is to be responsible for those actions that we do for reasons, we must be responsible for how we are, mentally speaking. That is, we must be responsible for our beliefs and our desires that are the reasons for our so acting. Okay, so think about a sort of silly case, right? Mad scientists come along and they put some beliefs in my head and some desires. I wake up, I act on those. Am I responsible for my actions? Well, it seems not, right? I had no control over the beliefs and desires that were put into my head, right? So I'm not responsible for beliefs and desires in that sort of case. So it seems like I'm not responsible for the actions that are performed. So to avoid that sort of case, right, what I need is that my beliefs and desires are chosen by me, right? That I've chosen them, right? When I choose those, right, when I'm responsible for how I am mentally speaking, I can be responsible for the actions that we do, or that I do, right? And quite generally, when we choose how we are mentally speaking, we can be responsible for those actions. Okay, so now the question is going to be, are we ever responsible for how we are mentally speaking in the right sort of way? Okay, well, if you've read the paper, which you should have, right, Strawson is going to argue that we aren't responsible for how we are mentally speaking in the right sort of way. To be so responsible requires an infinite regress. Okay, so what does that mean? Okay, so here's a quotation from Stephen Hawking in the beginning of A Brief History of Everything, I think? I'm not sure. Anyway, here's a quotation. A well-known scientist, some say it was Bertrand Russell, remember him, once gave a public lecture on astronomy. He described how the Earth orbits about the Sun, and how the Sun, in turn, orbits around the center of a vast collection of stars called our galaxy. At the end of the lecture, a little old lady at the back of the room got up and said, quote, "What you've told us is rubbish. The world is really a flat plate supported on the back of a giant tortoise." The scientist gave a superior smile before replying, "Well, what is this tortoise standing on?" "You're very clever, young man, very clever," said the old lady, "but it's turtles all the way down." Okay. Okay, so what's an infinite regress? So an infinite regress is the series of things, right, without end. Right, so in the tortoise story or turtle story or whatever, right, we have one turtle that supports the world, and a turtle under it that supports that turtle that supports the world, and a turtle under it that supports that turtle that supports that turtle that supports that turtle that supports the world, and so on, without end, right? It's turtles all the way down. That's an infinite regress. So in the picture that we have here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, yes, 7 turtles, not an infinite regress, finite regress, it ends, right? There's some bottom turtle. But in the infinite regress imagined, right, it's turtles quite literally all the way down. There's no final turtle. Okay, so we've been talking about different forms of argument so far in this course. And last week we talked about reductio ad absurdum arguments. This week we're going to talk about infinite regress arguments. So this is a form of argument. Arguments of this form purport to show that some claim leads to an infinite regress, and then the argument says we should reject the claim that leads to the infinite regress on the basis of its leading to an infinite regress. Okay, so maybe we could think now about what's problematic about infinite regresses. So think about the turtle case. Suppose this turtle is all the way down. What are we trying to explain, or what is the old lady trying to explain with this turtle? Well, I guess it's something like why the Earth doesn't fall through empty space, or something like this. So she says, well, there's a turtle that holds it up. Okay, so now here's a question. Why doesn't the turtle in the world fall through empty space? Well, I guess it's because there's a turtle under it. Okay, so why don't those 2 turtles in the world fall through empty space? Well, there's another turtle under it. Okay, why don't those 3 turtles with the world fall through empty space? Well, there's another turtle. Okay, so I'm not going to go on forever, but you get the point. So in each case, at each step, right, every time we introduce a new turtle, there's something that we want to explain. Namely, why doesn't something fall through infinite space or through empty space? And in each case, we like pull out another thing, another turtle, right, to explain why. So here's this thing we want to explain. We want to explain why the world doesn't fall through empty space. Here we say, well, there's a turtle. Well, why doesn't it fall? There's another turtle. So in each case, we sort of like give this explanation, but the explanation never ends. Right? But that's not how explanations are. They come to an end eventually. Right? And if they don't come to an end, then we never really explain what we wanted to explain in the first place, which is why the world doesn't fall through empty space. So this is an infinite regress. So what we should reject, I guess, in this case, is a claim that you need a turtle to hold up the world, something like that. Okay, so here's another infinite regress argument. This one's from Aquinas. This is an argument for the existence of God. It's what's called a cosmological argument. So let's try to unpack what's going on here. So here's the passage. In the world of sense, we find there's an order of efficient causes. So what are efficient causes? They're just like pushing and pulling causes. A billiard ball smashes into another and pushes it. So that's efficient causation. There's no case known, neither is it indeed possible, in which a thing is found to be the efficient cause of itself. For so it would be prior to itself, which is impossible, right? So the idea here is that no cause is its own cause, right? Nothing causes itself. Okay. Now, in efficient causes, it is not possible to go on to infinity. That is, there's no infinite regress, because in all efficient causes following an order, the first is the cause of the intermediate cause, and the intermediate is the cause of the ultimate cause, whether the intermediate cause be several or only one. So here's the picture. In every sort of like there's a first thing, some second or third or fourth or whatever thing, and some final thing, right? And the first thing causes the second, and the second causes the third, and the third causes the fourth, and so on until we finally cause the last thing, right? So causes go in order, right, temporally. Okay. Now, to take away the cause is to take away the effect. So the idea here is that if one thing causes another, then if the cause hadn't occurred, the effect wouldn't have occurred, right? So I'm throwing rocks at a window, right, and the window smashes, right, because the rock hits it. So the cause here is the throwing of the rock, or the rock hitting the window. The effect is the shattering of the window. Well, the window wouldn't have shattered, right, if I hadn't thrown the rock and the rock hadn't like hit the window. Okay, so if we imagine a world without the cause, right, without the hitting of the window, the effect, shattering of the window wouldn't have occurred. Okay, so here we are again. Now to take away the cause is to take away the effect. That's what we just explained. Therefore, if there be no first cause among efficient causes, there will be no ultimate nor any intermediate causes. But if in efficient causes it's possible to go on to infinity, there will be no first efficient cause. Neither will there be an ultimate effect, nor any intermediate efficient causes, all of which is plainly false. Okay, so here's the idea. Suppose, right, that causation goes back to infinity. There's no first cause. Well, in this case, there won't be a first cause, right? But then there won't be any ultimate effect because there won't be any intermediate efficient causes either, right? Remember, the first thing, the cause, is required for the effect, right? But if there is no first cause, there will be no subsequent effects, and in which case there will be no final effect. Right? But that's false, right? Things happen in the world. Look around, right? Therefore, Aquinas concludes, it's necessary to admit a first efficient cause, right? This thing, the uncaused cause, to which everyone gives the name of God. So this is an argument for the existence of God. It says, like, look, here are two ways the world could be. There could either be a first cause, or causes could go back to infinity. He says, well, look, they can't go back to infinity, right? Because then there'd be no way to explain how anything happens, right? Because there'd be no first cause, right? And we need that first cause to get the chain going. And then he concludes, well, there is a first cause, right? The thing that causes everything to happen, and that's God. So here's one way of reconstructing the argument. Premise one, suppose everything is caused. Premise two, if everything's caused, there will be nothing, right? This is the, therefore, if there be no first cause among efficient causes, there will be no ultimate nor any intermediate causes, right? But if in the efficient causation it's possible to go to infinity, there will be no first efficient cause, nor will there be an ultimate effect, nor any intermediate efficient causes. Right, so that's premise two. If everything's caused, there will be nothing. Premise three, there is something. That is, there are events. Or, for example, there are events. Here in the text, this is where Aquinas says, all of which is plainly false. Right, this is P3. There is something. Conclusion, it's necessary to admit a first efficient cause to which everyone gives the name of God. Conclusion, there's something uncaused that is the ultimate cause of everything else, namely God. So there's another infinite regress argument for you to chew on. Right? I know that we moved on from the God stuff quite quickly, but there you go. Okay, so let's go back to the basic argument. So remember, we're reconstructing it like this, just following Strawson. He gives a more careful reconstruction of it in the paper, where these sort of are laid out in more detail. But the idea is this. Premise one, nothing can be causa sui. That is, nothing can cause itself. Premise two, in order to be truly morally responsible for one's actions, one would have to be causa sui. Conclusion, therefore, nothing can be truly morally responsible. Okay, so let's talk about these premises one by one. Okay, why can nothing be causa sui? That is, why can nothing cause itself? Well, let's look at an example. Why did you log into Notebowl today? Okay, well, presumably because you believed that you needed to get on to Notebowl for some reason, perhaps to listen to this lecture, right? And you believed that by logging into Notebowl, you could find the lecture, right? So in this case, you acted for reasons. Okay, note that the reasons for which we act are our preferences or values, right? They're our beliefs, our desires. Okay. Okay, so we're responsible for our actions if the reasons for which we act are our own, if we're responsible for having those preferences, values, beliefs, desires. Okay, so now the question is going to be, are we responsible for our reasons? That is, our preferences, values, beliefs, and desires, right? If we're going to be responsible for our actions, for logging into Notebowl today, right, we must have chosen our reasons. So have we chosen our reasons? Well, some it seems, right? Perhaps you started the semester thinking, look, I want to be like a good student. I want to be responsible. So what you do, right? You go out into the world and you choose some principles by which you're going to live, right? You're going to be the sort of person who takes their studies seriously, right? Who stays on top of their work, right? You've chosen those reasons. But what about the reasons for which we chose those reasons? Okay, so why did you choose to be a better student this semester? Well, maybe because last semester was really rough or something, right? Okay. But that was a result of some preferences and values that you had, right? Perhaps you valued partying more than you valued studying, right? In that sort of case, why did you have those values? Did you choose those? Well, maybe. Maybe not. Suppose you didn't. Well, then you wouldn't be responsible for those, and you wouldn't be responsible for the things that caused you to choose to log into Notebowl today, so you wouldn't be responsible for logging into Notebowl today. But suppose you did choose to be the sort of person who enjoyed partying more than studying. Why are you the sort of person who valued those sorts of things? Well, again, we're going to have to appeal to some prior preferences and values, beliefs, and desires, and you see where this is going, right? It's going to go on forever. Right, but it seems impossible for it to go on forever, right? You came into existence at some point, right? And you ended up with some beliefs and desires very early on, some preferences and values. Where did they come from? Did you choose them? Well, they seem to just sort of be put into you, perhaps by your parents or society or whatever, right? What would be required, right, at every step in this process is that you chose those reasons yourself, right? You reflected on it and you decided that's the sort of person that I want to be. But did that ever happen? Well, it seems not. Could it happen? It also seems not. But why? Well, for it to have happened, I guess you would have had to sit there and think to yourself, well, that's the sort of person I wanted to be. Right? And if you're going to do that for any reasons, you need to have preferences and values. But where did those come from? Well, you couldn't have chosen them, right? Because we're choosing our initial ones right now. Right? So they must have just sort of come from nothing, right? Or from family. They had to come from outside of you. Okay. So either we have an infinite regress of these reasons, which is impossible, right? We for the simple reason that we haven't existed forever. Or our initial preferences, values, beliefs, desires are not ours, right? We didn't choose them. They were, in some sense, chosen for us. Okay, in order to be truly morally responsible for one's actions, this is the second premise, one would have to be causa sui, caused. Why? Well, if you haven't chosen to be a particular sort of way, or are a particular way as a result of chance or the vicissitudes of fate, then how can you be responsible? Right? You didn't choose that. Right? And responsibility seems to require a certain sort of control and clear-headed choice about what you're like. Right? So we started off with this example about the mad scientist, right, who puts a chip in your brain and makes you believe all sorts of crazy things. Right? Are you responsible for those beliefs? It seems not. Why? Well, because you didn't choose them. But if you didn't choose your initial beliefs and desires and preferences and values, right, if they were the result of heredity or society or religion or whatever, you seem by the same token not to be responsible for those. But if you're not responsible for those, then you seem not to be responsible for anything subsequent that's caused by those. And that's why premise 2, in order to be truly morally responsible for one's actions, one would have to be causa sui. Okay, now we have our argument, therefore nothing can be truly morally responsible. That's our conclusion. That's the basic argument. Okay, so that's a lot. At this point, you should probably reread those first few pages, right, and see if you have a better understanding of what's going on here. But sort of in closing, I want to reconsider our judgments about some cases. The easy case. In full command of my faculties, I judge that it's appropriate to knock Trevor down. I do so. Am I responsible for knocking Trevor down? So we wanted to say, or most people wanted to say, I think, that you were responsible. So what would Strawson say here? It seems like you're not going to be responsible, right? Because no one can be responsible for anything. Okay, so that's really weird. Okay, this is as clear a case of moral responsibility as any. How about a harder case? Right, Saddam Hussein, right, the torture case. Again, it seems like I'm not responsible, according to Strawson in the basic argument. And finally, in the another harder case, right, the addiction case, it also seems like I'm not responsible, according to Strawson. So those are the sort of hard cases to think about. In fact, they all end up being hard, right? It's only the cases where, like, the source of the action is outside of us, the case where the wind carries me away or whatever. I grab Devin's hands and start hitting him, and we ask whether Devin's responsible for hitting himself. It's only these sorts of cases, right, where it seems like we're not responsible. But what's sort of interesting here is that the basic argument takes the easy case, a harder case, and another harder case, and makes them almost exactly like those two cases that we got rid of. Right? In all of these cases, the source of the action ultimately is outside of us. Okay. So we started off by watching this documentary. You should have watched the documentary. I hope you enjoyed it. I think it's a great documentary. It's a lot of fun. I wish we could have watched it in class and sort of talked about it, but hey, here we are. Anyway, the sort of examples we've looked at are sort of more or less silly, right? But suppose Galen Strawson's right, or this basic argument is sound, right? It's not only valid, but its premises are true and its conclusion is true. In that sort of case, right, are Leopold and Loeb responsible for what they did? Here it seems not to matter, right, that they thought about it for a long time, right? They premeditated that they were going to murder Bobby Franks. Why doesn't it matter? Well, there were some reasons for which they acted, but were those reasons ultimately theirs? Well, why did they have those sorts of reasons? Well, we can tell a complicated story here about like their upbringing, the sort of experiences that they had. But were those their choices? Well, your upbringing seems to be beyond your control, right? And the circumstances in which they found themselves also seems to be beyond their control. So I guess it's something to think about. And we'll talk about it on Thursday in the sort of recitation section that we have planned. So I'm looking forward to seeing you all on Thursday. If you're in like another time zone or whatever where it's like impossible for you to meet, send me an email. Maybe we can meet and talk quickly at some point that's mutually agreeable. Otherwise, I'm going to record it and put it online. But look, if you don't have any good reason not to be there, I expect to see you there. I think we'll try it this week and see how it goes. But in any case, I miss all of you. This is much less fun than being in class, but yeah, okay. And I hope you're all well. Yeah, I'm trying to think if there's anything else. I don't think so, but if there is, I'll post something on Noble. So anyway, I'll see you Thursday.